Okay, people, final stanza. So in stanza 1, we're in the institution, and we're introduced to our two narrators, and they're walking through the institution and comparing it to hell. Stanza 2, we're thrown back to the battlefield, and the horrors of warfare, and we get stuck in the men's memories. And then in stanza 3, we're back in the institutions, looking and observing these men. And unfortunately for these boys, everything that they see reminds them of the bloodshed experienced and the horrors of warfare that we experienced with them in stanza 2. So we can see this imagery in these final 2 lines. So sunlight seems a blood smear, night comes blood black. So day and night remind them of death. And the colours remind them of blood. So that red blood smear and that blood black, we talked about that idea of the purple spurt in disabled. And so we know that if blood is a really dark colour, like a dark purple, we know that it's not yet oxygenated, meaning that it's come from an artery and it's pouring out, and it's not had a chance to oxygenate through the body. And so that's why that blood black, that's why blood can sometimes be black. We also have another image of a new day or of sunlight, with this dawn breaks open like a new wound, the simile, that bleeds afresh. So in this case, dawn, or usually dawn, represents new beginnings and hope. However, because it's being compared to a wound, we kind of have an opposite effect. So instead of a new day sort of bringing the ideas of it's a new day, perhaps today will be better, instead it's just like, they've picked off the scab and it starts to bleed again. And so it's this never-ending cycle of pain. And it's quite tragic that something that can be hope, bring hope, like dawn and sunlight, just reminds them of the pain and the suffering that they have been experiencing. That idea of picking at themselves, also that wound image is quite clear, and the idea of self-harm. And we see that idea of picking in the next line as well, or in the next section of lines. The other and final sort of thing to note about these 3 lines is this key diction here of the word shrink. Therefore, their eyeballs shrink tormented back into their brains, because on their scent sunlight seems a blood smear. So in this case, that shrink is like to hide away, to make yourself small, to turn away from the sights and sounds, the senses that remind them of the horrors of warfare and that are described in the last 2 lines. So that keyword shrink just implies that they're trying to hide away from it. It might also describe some of those images that we've seen in the pictures of PTSD, where the eyes do funny things. So in the next section, which is almost at the end of our poem, we're again back in the institution, and they are describing, or the narrators are describing, what they see. And we again have this idea that these guys have been driven mad by these images. Not only are they dying slowly, but they've been driven mad. Keywords like therefore from the last stanza, thus and thus, show us that the reason for their madness is because of what happened in stanza 2. And using words like therefore, thus, and thus, it gets us to refer back to stanza 2. Alliteration is really interesting, and sound again, with the heads wear this hilarious, hideous hands. And so that h sound is like a ha 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 ha. It mimics a laughing sound and can be connected to that idea of madness, and it's quite unsettling. And we feel that really unsettling image in this same top line. hilarious, hideous, and the next line down, awful falseness, a set smiling corpse. And so that imagery of something being hideous and the idea of corpses and the dead, but then comparing it with smiling and hilarious and that laughing sound kind of adds to the dis-ease of the stanza, and also that feeling of madness and that crazy laughter and smiling. The key word corpses is also important. It just tells us that these men are as good as dead, and essentially just now waiting for their bodies to give out. And the last thing that we could talk about in this, again, is around that self-harm, or the picking, or the, and that quite often is linked to people who are mentally ill or mentally unwell at a particular time, or having a breakdown, as they will pick at themselves, or they might have hallucinations and things like that. And you see that picking, like breaking open a wound and picking off the scab, and they pluck. Thus their hands are plucking at each other. It's like that they're picking at their hands, and they probably causing some bruises or some cuts. And this is one of the harder lines to sort of explain and analyze, but picking at the rope knots of their scourging. And so the rope knots and the scourging, so we've talked about the idea of a stroke, like being like the feel of a whip or of a cane. And so in religious belief, or in Catholic religious belief, you can repent your sins and you can ask for forgiveness, but you have to do some kind of penance or atone for what you have done wrong. So atonement just means to kind of suffer and to make things right. And so many, many years ago, in particular, so like monks, and if you've seen Dan Brown's, there's a movie made of it. What is it called? I can't remember. I'll remember the name. It's not Angels and Demons. It's the one before that. You see one of the characters, and he does things like he whips himself after he's killed someone. And so it's this idea of paying penance, or it's causing some self-harm to make amends or to atone for their sins. And so in this case, the sins probably were carried out by the hands. And so that's kind of why they might be punishing themselves in their hands. It might be that the hands are the ones causing harm, and so it's like they're picking out the knots. And so in a whip, to make it more painful, what they would do is they would tie knots into it, and so it was more painful. And so they might be pulling at the knots of the whip, or pulling at their knuckles, maybe because they have been committing some self-harm. And it's just that idea of the fact that they are, this is a hellish place. It's full of sin, and it's a place full of regret and madness. Do read that there. It might have explained it a bit better than I have right now. The last two lines of the poem. So now the mental cases, the men are desperate for help from whoever sent them to war. So we don't know at this point who those people are. We don't know who our narrators are, but we in this line learn that they perhaps are guilty of sending these boys off to war. And so we see snatching at us who smote them, brother, pawing us who dealt them war and madness. So the us is referring to the narrator, and probably bringing in the audience. So in this case, its intention might be to make you feel guilty, or to help us understand that these narrators are people who sent them to war and are guilty of dealing this fate to them. Another key piece of diction is that word smote, and so we've got some more ancient language. To smote means it's the past tense of smite, and which means to destroy absolutely, leaving nothing. And this is like the men. They're only the shell. They're only the case of somebody. So their bodies, minds and lives have been completely and utterly annihilated. And that's what that word smoked means. It also helps to create that ancient tone and reminds us of Dante's Inferno. Working with the us, the diction is the key piece of diction, brother. And this says that those who he's asking for help from their brothers. This might be their biological brother or their fellow soldier who is the narrator. It might be, we don't know who the narrator is. It could be, family, it could be friends, it could be the general public, it could be propagandists, it could be the generals who sent them to war, or the government. And that's kind of reinforced, that idea, with the word dealt. Dealt is usually a word that we say, the cards that fate has dealt you, or it could be used as a dealer in a game of cards or gambling. And so in this case, what they've gambled is the men's lives. And it's got that connotation of a game. And so it might be saying that the men, the narrators, are generals who use their lives as just a pawn in a game or as a gamble. And they're asking them for help. And we've got the keywords of snatching and pawing. These verbs are also in present tense. They're a present participle. And it creates that sense of desperation for help. And we see, again, what we saw in the first stanza of this dehumanization of the boys, of the mental cases. They're no longer human. They've lost their humanity with that word pawing. And it's like they're an animal, asking for help. Or we often think, if these men were animals, perhaps they would have been done the kindness of being put down. So we are, with this last line, we're kind of positioned to feel pity for the mental cases, and perhaps guilty as somebody who encouraged them to be sent to war. So that there is the last stanza. Your job is to do some illustrations. You might just pick some really clear images from the poem. You could do one little picture per line, set of lines that I've unpacked, or you could do it stanza by stanza. That's up to you. I will attach a picture I've done a couple lines for you so you can see the level of artistry I'm expecting. It is not very high, so do take a look at that. And if you really like this poem and are interested in doing the exam on it, I would recommend doing those tasks, these ones here. Just pick one per stanza, and it just helps you to unpack some of those sound devices and language features a little bit more. Good luck. Do flick me an email if you are wanting to clarify anything or get some feedback. Happy analysing.